Thank you very much, Jamie and Chad. That was a really interesting presentation, and again, great timing with the paper that just came out. So maybe I'll actually start the discussion by taking two questions that were directed at your presentation. So Alex asked if you used a systematic review method to select the 15 papers that were analyzed, and also why were these ones selected from the 100 samples. And the second question by Martin Volsink is about the concept of community, and you say that it should be flexible to fit to the project, but shouldn't the project also be flexible to fit the community? So he highlights that probably they should be mutually adapting. And also he says this also means why community wind instead of community distributed renewable energy systems. So if you want to answer or comment on those.
Chad, could I let you answer that first question, the technical question about systematic review? It was not a systematic review, but you can provide some more detail about how the narrowing.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, the narrowing really occurred because of our focus on case study research focused on community wind. So there was a lot, you saw we originally kind of pared it down to 65 articles that we thought were, and I guess another qualifying kind of statement is we were looking at a 10-year period from beginning in 2008 with the Walker and Divine Right framework to 2018. So we did full text reviews of the 65 that we thought were based on community wind and were empirical and were case studies. And we had to eliminate 50 essentially because they were looking at oftentimes a variety of technologies not focused on wind, or maybe it wasn't actually community wind, or there wasn't much empirics to it. So that's essentially what narrowed it down, and allowing for just 15, while it seems like a low sample, it allowed for really in-depth and full text reviews, which was really needed. If you read through the paper, like the detail we go into each paper, I don't think would have been possible if we would have moved much further beyond the 15. So yeah.
In terms of Martin, in terms of your question, for sure, why the project should be flexible, and that's the green circle in our diagram. The idea that when you go to a collection of farms or houses in a rural area, that has an historical context, that has a community history, and the developers or even the municipality, province, whatever, needs to understand what has gone on there over the decades that have before their arrival, to understand what the needs might be there. And in fact, some communities are very welcoming of wind. Others, I mean, we think of communities of leisure. In Ontario, we have lots of cottaging in both the south of the province along the Great Lakes and further north. And that's one of the conflicts, is there are these people who ex-urbanites from the city who have cottages and are focused on that aspect of the rural idyll that Chad talked about earlier. And that creates, and there's the conflict with farmers who may see this as a way of dealing with declining prices in whatever thing they've been growing. Tobacco was one of the ones that we studied. Communities that were moving from tobacco to something else, and that they're very open to the idea. So that you may, by going to such a community, you may be creating very strong community divisions, and in other cases it may be very welcome.
Okay, thank you again. So maybe now I would ask, well, I don't know if Jeremy wants to ask the question himself, or Jean-Pierre, the one that you had asked earlier on. well, otherwise, if Jean-Pierre wants to discuss this issue of Jeremy asked, what role will context play in your research? And by that, he means consideration of land-based resources versus ocean-based resources, commercial fishing, maritime transportation, etc.
Thanks, Susanna. I sent a little message to Jeremy to try and respond to that. I don't have a very good answer yet, and I think it's something that I need to pay attention to more, particularly how to control for background issues that may have a kind of a background influence in the variable development of the offshore industry. So my initial stab would be was that I was going to focus on a broad range of interest groups that shaped, for instance, marine spatial planning and other elements of the policy mix, and that might give insight into some of the more kind of background drivers. But yeah, thanks for the point. I don't yet have a good answer.
Okay, thank you. So I would also like, before we end the session and before taking some more questions, to ask all of the presenters, if they don't mind, to turn on their videos, just so that we can take a screenshot of the panel. Thank you. So in the meantime, there's also Elizabeth has asked a small question to, again, Jamie and Shad. She says that she's currently playing with the same framework and found your 3D proposition interesting. Do you think that investment scale could be understood as ownership structures? And
yeah, certainly. Yeah, certainly the ideas overlap. For us, the scale, the main aspect of scale was that to focus on the local. That when we were talking, that when some people were talking about community wind, they were meaning community in the sense of a very large community of interest. But we ended up. So that's represented by the house, the origin, but in terms of investment scale, it's not entirely the ownership structure, because you can still have a cooperative with investment from locals only, or from foreign investors or very distant investors. So it's not a precise overlap.
Thank you. Robert and Alex, I've seen that you've already kind of replied to one of the questions that someone asked you, but maybe do you want to comment as well on Ben Owen's suggestions of other factors to take into account in your work?
Yeah, sure, Susanna. Yeah, I also wrote a small reply to Ben, but yeah, they're really useful suggestions, and we'll definitely take them on board. We had also considered expanding to look at other policies such as subsidies and grants and stuff like that. For the moment, we started with specifically research and innovation policies just to keep it manageable. But yeah, maybe we might have a second think about that, because if they play such a large role, then we might need to incorporate those. And in terms of investment, it was also interesting that Ben pointed out that they generally fund their own R&D. Although in an interview we had, it does seem that patents are an increasingly important part of the income of these companies. So in a sense, yeah, there's also interesting dynamics there in terms of how they do actually fund their own R&D, which we will look into. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So I've seen that there's like a couple of other questions, specifically by Bonnie Ram and by David K, regarding the presentation of Jamie and Shad. So maybe you'd like to answer them in the chat. I guess I would now suggest that maybe we can still have a small break if we're trying to keep the schedule of the next session, but maybe Garant can let us know if we should move on or have still more time for discussion.
I wanted to take just a couple minutes break, so why don't we just take one more question? We'll get a 2-minute break then as soon as that's over.
Okay, so maybe Bonnie, would you like to go ahead and just ask your questions to Jamie and Chad?
I was just typing my response to Bonnie, and I accidentally sent it to just Geraint. So the idea of, you know, would we also advocate for measuring project risks and uncertainties? And certainly, I mean, this is where I started in all this, is the social construction of risk. My concern was that I'd been focusing too much on, or we had been focusing too much on the negatives. What are the health concerns? What are the noise annoyance concerns? What are the concerns about shadow flicker and so on? And the whole idea of the MOCWI study, the meaning of community wind energy study, is start from a positive. Like, okay, community wind energy is supposed to be the thing that will solve all these problems. Let's define what this is first, and then go back to measuring all the other things we measured with these 4 concepts as well. So yeah, indeed, we will continue to measure all of these perceptions of risks at the same time that we would measure the community wind energy variables.